All right. Today we're going to talk about the cardiovascular responses to exercise. We're going to first start off by talking about the general responses that you guys are already familiar with. I mean, you guys already know that heart rate and blood flow go up when you exercise. That's pretty intuitive. But then we're going to talk about why that happens. What factors have to adapt to allow you to increase your heart rate, to allow you to increase your blood flow, and all of that. We'll talk about how the body senses changes in the cardiovascular system and elicits an increase in heart rate, blood flow, blood pressure, all of that. And then we'll get in at the end and talk about different scenarios where vascular function and health can impact exercise performance or in other cases, and even life. All right? So this diagram is something that I hope that you'll work on. Here I say, with a neighbor, answer the following questions. How about we do this? Since I'm guessing that you don't have someone from class there on isolation with you from the coronavirus, let's see if you can at least explain these to yourself or explain this to a family member. Tell them why blood pressure increases. Remember to use equations. So here, I'll get you started. So remember, mean arterial pressure is equal to cardiac output times total vascular resistance. Okay, use that equation to explain why blood pressure is going up. Next, why does cardiac output increase? Well, cardiac output is equal to what? Heart rate times stroke volume. And so you can say, okay, what factors cause an increase in heart rate? What factors cause an increase in stroke volume? And then what is the arterial venous oxygen difference? That's this thing over here. That is the difference in the content of oxygen in an artery, C little a, O2, minus the content of oxygen in a vein. So if you remember, well, first let's just talk conceptually. So what this AVO2 difference is you have a certain amount of oxygen in the artery before it gets to the muscle, and then a certain amount of oxygen in the vein when it gets out of the muscle. The vein will always be less. How much less is the difference? The reason that the venous oxygen content is lower than the arterial oxygen content is because the muscle is consuming it. So the arterial venous oxygen difference tells us about how much oxygen is being taken out of the blood. Now, what is the CaO2? Do you remember this long equation? You definitely need to know this. Concentration of hemoglobin times 1.34 times the percent saturation over 100. This tells you how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. And then we also have to add in the part that's dissolved, and how much oxygen gets dissolved is the pressure of oxygen times this constant of 0.003. For every millimeter of mercury of pressure of oxygen, there is 0.003 milliliters of oxygen dissolved in the blood per deciliter of blood. So this is how much is dissolved. Let's see if you guys can read all this over the top of the graphs. Study these. Make sure you know these equations. I cannot emphasize enough for this upcoming test. You need to understand the equations. All right, so how does the body, the cardiovascular system in particular, adjust to constant load exercise? It's going to look a whole lot like the graphs that we have for the O2 deficit and VO2 when we start exercise. So let's just assume that I'm on the side of a treadmill and the belt is going under me at 7 miles per hour, and I jump on the belt and start running at 7 miles per hour right away. That's what we have going on here. Now, just if you remember VO2, let's add another one on here. Let's say this is VO2. You remember, if here's the start of exercise with this little arrow, VO2 starts off low and then gradually goes up. But what about the ATP demand? ATP demand is going to look like that, right? So we have that O2 deficit in there, where the VO2, the rate of oxygen consumption, is not equal to the rate of ATP demand. So you have to have this anaerobic component. Now look how cardiac output here, stroke volume, and heart rate all follow that same curve. It makes sense because the cardiovascular system is strongly involved in the delivery of oxygen and aerobic metabolism. And so we see this same trend where your heart rate and cardiac output doesn't go up like this in a square wave, right? You're not going to see heart rate go from resting at 60 beats per minute to exercise at 180 beats per minute right away. You don't see that. You've never experienced that in your life, hopefully. It doesn't sound like it would be too comfortable. It's always a gradual deal. Just to give you some insight onto what this might look like during exercise, here is my heart rate response doing some interval exercise. So let me get my pen color changed here. This would be a good one. All right, so what happened is I started at rest, and then right about here, I would do a sprint, rest, sprint, rest, sprint, rest, sprint, rest, sprint, okay? Actually, the problem with this is that they should all be the same height. So I would go up and sprint, rest, sprint. So I did the same power each time. And what you can see is that even though this isn't technically constant load, because I'm sprinting, resting, like in an interval workout, you can see heart rate goes up gradually. Actually, my resting, if I look at it closely, resting is right here. I'd hit this peak, and all of this is rest. Once I hit that peak, and it starts to go down, that's going to be rest. So, man, I'm really messing this one up. So it'd really be a sprint, rest, sprint, rest. So heart rate goes up while I'm sprinting, and then when I stop exercising, it almost immediately begins to start going back down. But it doesn't go down in a square wave. My heart rate doesn't follow the same pattern as my workout, right? Heart rate isn't doing this square wave deal where as soon as I stop exercising, it goes to resting values. You have a slow recovery. And gradually it keeps getting up and up and up. Here's another example. This is a different workout. So this is when I was doing 300 watts on a bike, and I held it for as long as I could, which ended up being about 3 minutes. So during a light warm-up, my heart rate was about 100 beats per minute, and right here I start exercising at 300 watts. You can see right at the initial phase, I get this fast increase initially, and then a gradual increase after that until right here, I fatigued. And then once I fatigued, I stopped exercising and my heart rate goes down. So constant load exercise, why am I not hitting a steady state? Why isn't it doing plateauing like that? The reason, hopefully you can remember this from previous, the reason is I'm at a very high intensity. I'm in the severe intensity domain. So I'm above critical power. If I was below critical power and below lactate threshold especially, it would just go up and hit a plateau and I'd be able to go for a really long time. It wouldn't have just been 3 minutes until I fatigued. It'd be like an hour or two, or until my show that I was watching got over. I like to work out watching shows. It keeps me distracted so that I can handle the discomfort associated with a really high heart rate. My max heart rate is 180 beats per minute, 170, 180 beats per minute. So I'm really high intensity here. All right, so heart rate, just like the VO2, just like other things we talked about, if you don't get a steady state, that's because you're above lactate threshold. And if you're above lactate threshold, you'll eventually get a steady state after about 10 minutes. If you're above critical power, you'll never get a steady state, right? It'll just keep going up until you hit your max heart rate, your VO2 max, right in there, and you fatigue. All right, so now let's determine how hard the heart is working. So your heart is a muscle, right? Every time it's beating, it's ejecting blood. That stroke volume, it ejects the blood. It has to work. It's doing actin and myosin contractions. The actin and myosin are hooking up, consuming ATP. It's doing work. How do we determine how much work the heart is doing? Well, there's a really easy estimate that you can use. It's not perfect, but it will give you an idea. And this is often used clinically to determine the work of the heart. So let's look at this. We got two twins, James and John, both 24 years old, both weigh 72 kilos, same height, same weight. They both have the same heart rate, right? So they're exercising, they're both going at 120 beats per minute, but one of them has a systolic pressure of 120, the other has a systolic pressure of 160. That systolic pressure is a direct product of how hard your heart is contracting. So, if you were lifting, let's just pretend this isn't the heart. Let's pretend they're doing bicep curls. The heart rate would be the repetition frequency, right? So they're both doing 120 reps per minute, which would be ridiculously fast for a bicep curl. And then the systolic pressure would be the weight that they're lifting. So essentially, James over here is lifting 120 pounds every bicep curl, where John is lifting more every contraction with 160 pounds. The volume of work being done is the product of the repetitions times the weight. This would also just be the work. And if you want to quantify how much the power output is, then you divide that work by time and you can get the power. All right, so now let's just apply all of this to the heart. We have something called the rate pressure product. Sometimes, like when you get to med school, you might hear it called the double product. What this is it's the heart rate, so the frequency times the systolic pressure. And this is going to give us an estimate of the power output and how hard the heart is working. Does it make sense to you that if your heart has to generate 160 millimeters of mercury pressure, that systolic pressure, that it's working harder than it does when it has to generate just 120? It's the same, conceptually, it's the same idea as lifting 160 pounds versus 120 pounds. That systolic pressure is how much force, directly proportional to how much force the heart has to generate. So with this double product or rate pressure product, you can get an idea really easy with measurements that almost anyone can make in any kind of hospital or exercise setting to figure out how hard the heart is working. And the higher the product, the greater the work of the heart. Now, so let's think about this. Let me erase some of this so we can clear some space. Things that will increase either the heart rate or the systolic pressure will increase how hard the heart is working. So let's say you have someone with high blood pressure, right? High blood pressure, that is most of the time it's meaning that the systolic pressure is really high. So for a given heart rate, now they have a higher blood pressure. That means the heart is working a lot harder. So instead of the heart lifting 120 millimeters of mercury with every beat, now it's lifting 160 millimeters of mercury with every beat. It's a lot more work on the heart. And what do you think is going to happen? If you're trying to lift 160 millimeters of mercury or 160 pounds with your biceps every minute, 120 times a minute, you're going to get fatigued, right? You're going to fatigue faster in this scenario than you would in the scenario with a lower blood pressure. This systolic pressure, this high systolic pressure, increases the work of the heart. And in cases where especially with people with weak hearts, it's going to cause fatigue. People with heart failure, essentially heart failure is a fatigued, exhausted heart. Just imagine how your bicep is going to feel after doing a bunch of contractions. Fatigued, right? That is what heart failure is. The heart is just fatigued. It can't eject enough blood, and it's trying as hard as it can, but it's just exhausted, right? So in these scenarios, when people have a weak heart, you want to avoid situations that are going to increase the systolic pressure or increase the heart rate too much. So in heart failure, or one of the treatments can be a medication that will dilate the arteries and decrease resistance, so you don't have to generate as much pressure. Another scenario in heart failure, this all depends on the stage. Sometimes at the early stages of heart failure, they can have a really high blood pressure. And later stages, the heart gives up, everything gives up, and blood pressure goes really low. So you wouldn't want to dilate everything in late heart failure. But other scenarios, one really common thing is a beta blocker. So a beta blocker is a medication that blocks the sympathetic nervous system at the heart. So you can't have epinephrine, norepinephrine causing heart rate to spike. And so by decreasing the heart rate, how much the heart rate is going, you're decreasing the double product, decreasing that rate pressure product, making the heart get a chance to relax. It'll also decrease blood pressure. And so this rate pressure product is just a really rough but decent way to get an idea of how hard the heart is working, how much ATP it's consuming. All right, now let's move on to something really cool. This brings in some more stuff about temperature regulation that we'll talk about in another chapter. Whenever you're exercising, if I just have you go at an exercise at a moderate intensity, so not severe, not heavy intensity. Let's just say you're doing moderate intensity where you get a steady state really quickly. Heart rate will go up like that, not quite as quickly. It'll go up gradually and you'll hit this steady state and it'll stay there for a long time, right? If you're in a nice, cool environment, that's how it's going to go. The heart rate will stay steady. But if you're exercising in a hot environment, you have something called cardiovascular drift that will occur. Now, these graphs over here, these represent the cardiovascular response, cardiac output, stroke volume, and heart rate during exercise in the heat. So look, you're exercising, you're running 7 miles per hour below lactate threshold. Let's say you have cardiac output is going to be pretty steady that whole time. You have the same cardiac output, but stroke volume is decreasing over time. Why would stroke volume decrease? There's a couple of theories on this. One of the leading theories on why stroke volume is going to decrease is because when you're in a cool environment, most of your blood when you're exercising is going to be going to the active muscles. But when you're in a hot environment, now the blood has a second function. Instead of just delivering oxygen and glucose and all that to the muscle, the blood also has to deliver heat out to the skin. So you have a big increase in blood flow to the skin. So when that blood goes out to the skin, the theory is that there's less blood, or that it takes longer for the blood to return back. So you have lower venous return and a lower stroke volume. So as you exercise in the heat, your body gets hotter and hotter, and it needs to put more heat out to the skin with the blood. And so now that's less to return. But look, cardiac output is maintaining during that exercise. Even though stroke volume is going down during this prolonged exercise, cardiac output is maintained. So why is that? It's because heart rate is increasing. Okay, so the body increases heart rate to compensate for this decreased stroke volume. Now, anyone that goes on further in exercise physiology, you'll learn that there's a little bit of debate on chicken or the egg here. Is it the heart rate that causes, is it the decrease in stroke volume that causes the increase in heart rate, or vice versa? Most of the evidence points towards the stroke volume decreasing first, but it's still up for debate. Now, why would this matter? Let's say that you're exercising, that you're running at a marathon, and you're running in the heat, and you want to run at a certain heart rate. You're going to see that if your heart rate is increasing over time, even though you're running the same speed, in this scenario, like in this study, what they're showing is they're running the same speed the whole time, but heart rate is going up. So if you're trying to keep the same running speed, but you're going off of heart rate in the heat, your running speed is going to drop while heart rate stays the same, right? So just keep that in mind when you're training. You'll see this cardiovascular drift, and you won't have the same speed for a given heart rate when you're running. Splitting up the blood flow out to the skin also has consequences. We'll just do this again, right? We have the VO2. You can calculate as being equal to cardiac output times the AVO2 difference. My pen's dying. All right. So the VO2 is equal to cardiac output times AVO2 difference. This cardiac output refers to blood flow, cardiac output to the muscle. And if you have more blood going out to the skin, that's less going to the muscle. And that means you're not going to be able to have as much of a VO2, not as much aerobic ATP resynthesis in the muscle, and you slow down. You'll fatigue faster in the heat. And that's one of the reasons. And we'll have several days in the next week where we talk about temperature regulation. All right, now what determines your heart rate? How does your heart rate, your cardiovascular system, the blood pressure, resistance, all that, how does it respond to exercise? What controls that? The systems are pretty similar to what we saw during pulmonary, like what determines your breathing response to exercise. You have several factors. Here's a diagram that kind of illustrates several of those different factors. I'm going to refer mostly to this diagram over here. It's a little simpler. You have everything being controlled by the cardiovascular control center in your brain. Down in your brain stem, all right, around here, you just have this, that's the final trigger, which sends out nervous system control to the different parts of the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular control center, it decides how much the blood vessels constrict, how fast the heart rate goes. And so how does it do that? The cardiovascular control center is going to be integrating information from several different spots. The first one is from higher parts of the brain. This is a feed forward. A feed forward system. And what that means is that as you start to exercise, the brain, as it's sending out information to the muscle to contract, it's also simultaneously sending information to the cardiovascular control center that it's about to exercise, and it tells it about how hard the exercise is. And so it will respond and change the heart rate in anticipation for how hard the exercise is. Now you also have information coming from baroreceptors. These baroreceptors are pressure sensors in the arterial circulation that tells the brain if its blood pressure is sufficient. If your blood pressure goes too low, you can't perfuse blood. You need pressure to push the blood throughout the body. And if blood pressure is too low, you pass out. All right. So the body's closely monitoring blood pressure, and these pressure sensors that we'll talk about are relaying information to the control center saying, hey, blood pressure dropped a little too much, or blood pressure went up, we need to adjust. We don't want to get too crazy here, right? We want to keep blood pressure in a narrow range. So it's receiving information from there. You also have these chemo and mechanoreceptors throughout the body, like the type 3-4 afferents that tell the brain what's going on in the muscle. It will tell it about acid and movement and all that. So all the information goes into the cardiovascular control center, which then tells blood vessels and the heart how to respond. One thing that's not on here, I just realized that. This might be getting a little too deep for you guys, probably not. But you also have a little bit of automatic control in the blood vessels. It's called autoregulation. In autoregulation, the blood vessels are sensing changes in flow and pressure, and they'll dilate and constrict in response and try and keep blood flow within a set range. So independent of the brain, the arteries will constrict and dilate. They constrict and dilate in people who are paralyzed. Right? So you have this autoregulation or self-control in the blood vessels. Similar with the heart rate will, without the brain, it will respond to increases in epinephrine floating around from hormones and all of that, and it maintains its own beat. All right, so let's talk about these things one by one. This is one of my favorite studies. This one tells us the importance of central command, or the higher brain centers, right? The feed forward. Before any exercise occurs, the brain is signaling to the cardiovascular control center, telling it about the exercise. It's saying, hey, we're about to exercise, get prepared. And in the cardiovascular control center will boost heart rate in response before you even do a contraction. Now, here's one of the best examples of this. Back in 2001, a group in Texas, they found a bunch of people that could either be hypnotized or not hypnotized. And they had the people, the high hypnotized group, this is what their heart rate response was when they were actually exercising. So they had them do a hand squeezing exercise, just like illustrated down here. And they measured heart rate, blood pressure, all of that, perceived exertion during exercise, and that's what they responded. Now they hypnotized them. They apparently got some hypnotists out of the yellow pages and said, hey, come do this awesome party for us. We're going to have a bunch of research going on. So these people, they laid down, and the hypnotist told them that they were exercising. They said, the hypnotist told them, imagine you're exercising, or you think you're exercising. I don't know how hypnotism works exactly, but it's a pretty cool study here. Even though they're not lifting a finger, heart rate was still going up in those people that were able to be hypnotized. In people who were not able to be hypnotized, heart rate didn't change, right? So what this shows us is just the thought of exercising causes a cardiovascular response. When you're at the start of your race and you're getting ready to go, heart rate, ventilation, all these things are increasing in anticipation of the exercise. Your body doesn't want to have to always be on a feedback system, right? It doesn't want to wait until something isn't sufficient to increase heart rate. It is proactive, and in anticipation of exercise, it increases, and then lets feedback from these other systems, like the skeletal muscle and the baroreceptors. It lets the feedback then fine tune it. All right, so that's the feed forward coming from the higher brain centers. Now let's talk about baroreceptors. You have these pressure, baro means pressure, like barometer, right? You have these pressure sensors in the aortic arch and the carotid, the bifurcation of the carotid artery. These are aortic bodies and carotid bodies. Right in the same spot, we were sensing PCO2 in our blood for ventilation. Here we're sensing pressure as well. Notice right away the pressure is sensed in the artery, aorta, carotid artery. We're not looking at pressure in the vein. Your body, as far as I know, really doesn't care all that much about pressure in the vein. It's only sensing, or I can't say only, but it's primarily sensing and monitoring pressure in the arterial circulation. Now, what happens here is you sense pressure there. These little bodies, notice the difference in pressure inside of the artery. So let's say here's the artery wall. So you have pressure inside, pressure in, pressure out. The aortic bodies and carotid bodies, they just sense the gradient in pressure between in and out, the difference. And in research, we use that to our advantage. I won't go into too much detail, but here we have one of my buddies, Steve. We have him hooked up to a machine, and it's placed right over the neck where the carotid bodies are. And we have these tubes that are literally hooked up to a vacuum. It's a little fancier, like a fancy vacuum, but it's a vacuum. And we have it sucking air. So if we have, here's the wall again. Pressure in, pressure out. So on the outside, we put a big negative pressure. All right, so we're sucking. And these baroreceptors sense that sucking as an increase in the gradient. The gradient used to be kind of small with P in and P out, and now it has a bigger gradient, so the arteries sense that as a big increase in blood pressure. We basically are hacking the carotid receptors to test how well the body is changing and responding to changes in blood pressure. So here's what you got to understand about this. If the baroreceptors are sensing the gradient in pressure, and it wants to maintain a certain gradient. Now, under normal circumstances, the pressure outside isn't going to change all that much, but the pressure inside will. With exercise, pressure goes up, right? And so the baroreceptors sense that increase in pressure gradient here, and it will adjust so that blood pressure doesn't get too high or too low. I just include this because I think it's funny to see my friend getting strangled by a machine in the lab. All right, so here's what the baroreceptors are actually doing. So we have them right in here in the aortic, carotid bodies, aortic bodies. They're sensing the difference in pressure inside and outside of the artery. Stretch on these baroreceptors. So if you have a high pressure gradient on them, it goes and inhibits the sympathetic nerves, right? So what do sympathetic nerves do? Sympathetic nerves increase blood pressure. And if the aortic bodies and carotid bodies sense too much pressure, they turn the sympathetic nerves off so that pressure goes back down. Now on the flip side, if they have not enough pressure, let's say you're starting to go hypotensive, you're dehydrated, or you're having hemorrhage and you're losing blood, your aortic bodies and carotid bodies are going to sense that decrease in pressure. They're not going to be stretched enough. And so what do? They stop inhibiting the sympathetic nerves. So now the sympathetic nerves can fire unrestrained and blood pressure goes up. Heart rate will go up. So this will impact heart rate and resistance, right? So the sympathetic nerves will increase the heart rate to increase cardiac output. It will increase the vasoconstriction of the arteries to increase the resistance, all to maintain your blood pressure in the right spot. Now, what's really cool is that the pressure that these aortic and carotid bodies are trying to guard, it's not constant. At exercise, the brain tells them to hold the pressure here. So let's say this is millimeters of mercury. So that'd be at rest. During exercise, the body knows that you need higher blood pressure to accommodate greater flow. And so now it says guard this pressure instead. So now instead of trying to keep blood pressure really low during exercise, it tries to keep blood pressure at this higher spot to maintain adequate pressure to distribute the flow. One thing that happens with these baroreceptors, their sensitivity and the pressure that they guard gets messed up with aging and in diseases. And while this was exercise that we were illustrating, sometimes in disease and age, come on, don't end show. Don't you hate when this doesn't work? So in disease, they can try and guard a higher pressure as well. So part of what causes hypertension in older people sometimes is the baroreceptors trying to guard a higher pressure than normal. All right, so what other things that impact the cardiovascular response? You have these afferents, right? Type 3, type 4 afferents, just the sensory nerves in the muscle. We've talked about these all semester. These sensory nerves will tell the brain how much exercise is going on. They sense movement and they sense metabolites. So things like acid, heat, potassium. These factors are going to be relayed back to the brain. The nerves will tell them, hey, we got a lot of heat down here. We got a lot of potassium down here, a lot of ADP. We need more blood flow. And so in response to that, the heart will increase cardiac output. Blood pressure will go up to try and perfuse more blood. You can mess with these actually. So here's a study. This shows the change in mean arterial pressure doing a hand grip exercise. And so here's blood pressure at rest. Blood pressure at rest is not zero. This is just change from rest. So resting, of course, it hasn't changed, right? So when you start to exercise, this would be so let's look at normotensive, the dash here. It kind of doesn't show up, the dash. Normal exercise, blood pressure will go up about 20 millimeters of mercury and then come back down when you stop exercising. Now, part of that increase in blood pressure is going to be coming from central command, the baroreceptors, and these afferents. Now, we can hijack this and we can put a blood pressure cuff on the arm right when they stop exercising. So if we put a cuff on and don't let the metabolites like the ADP or the acid diffuse out, blood pressure doesn't go down as much and it stays elevated. So you can see having a good blood flow to recover from exercise helps your cardiovascular system calm down after exercise. With this blood pressure cuff on, we don't let the blood flow get rid of the acid. It's all trapped in the muscle. That acid and other things are stimulating the afferents and keeping heart rate and mean arterial pressure elevated as if you were still exercising. So it's important to have good blood flow. All right. Now, all those factors are going to come together to influence your cardiovascular response to exercise. Now I just want to wrap it up by giving you some ideas on when the vascular health can influence exercise performance. And this is a lot of what I research. I'll show you some results from a study that we did a little while ago. So in this study, we wanted to know how the health of your arteries, the health of that endothelium. You remember the endothelium, it releases nitric oxide and other things to cause dilation. So we measured the health of the artery. I won't tell you exactly how we did that. Just suffice it to say that we measured the endothelial health and tested how well they could dilate and constrict. And then we wanted to know how much that influences a person's exercise performance and their blood flow. So what we did, we had them do single leg knee extension exercise. So here's an example of the exercise. The guy's kicking, and he's attached to a flywheel. So he's basically riding a bike with his leg, and here we're measuring with ultrasound, we're measuring blood flow through the femoral artery. That's the artery that provides blood to all the little muscles in the leg. That's no slight on Jason. His muscles aren't little. They're just not that big for anyone. So here we're measuring blood flow with ultrasound, and we can measure how much blood is going through there. So now in that study, we measured the maximum work a person could do during this single leg exercise. And we also measured the maximum blood flow they could deliver. And here's what we found. Ignore that. We found that people that have good endothelial function, the PLM, that just think of that as endothelial function. People that had good endothelial function for any given power output, or not any, for higher power outputs and maximum exercise, they were able to achieve much greater blood flow. And with that greater blood flow and oxygen delivery, they were also able to get a higher work rate. They could do more work. So let's flip it the other way. having low endothelial function, a low capacity to dilate your arteries, resulted in lower blood flow at a given exercise intensity and a lower maximum blood flow. So what's going to happen? If we decrease blood flow, we're right here, we're decreasing the skeletal muscle circulation. We're not going to deliver as much oxygen there. And if we're not getting as much oxygen, the mitochondria have less oxygen to consume and we won't have as great of a VO2. And so at these intensities where these people have low blood flow, it's very possible that they have low oxygen delivery and lower oxygen consumption. They're more reliant on anaerobic mechanisms to do 30 watts of exercise. And if you're more reliant on anaerobic mechanisms at 30 watts, you're going to fatigue faster, right? Anaerobic metabolism fatigues fast. So you want good blood flow, good artery health, and good blood flow to keep that exercise performance. Now, let's talk about heart failure and angina. So I've changed this diagram. Instead of saying just muscle, I've emphasized cardiac muscle. So this is really fun. In the diagram, we have the lungs that get the oxygen, it diffuses into the blood, then the heart pumps that blood throughout the body. And one of the places it pumps it, instead of skeletal muscle, this is cardiac or coronary circulation. The heart has to pump blood to itself, right? If the heart doesn't get enough blood, that means it doesn't get enough oxygen and it's going to fatigue. So atherosclerosis is where you start to get these plaques forming in the arteries. So normally you'd have this whole lumen, that whole side inside, to flow blood, a big radius. But with these plaques, we're decreasing the radius. Remember, flow, let's see if this will work. Flow is equal to the change in pressure times radius to the fourth power over 8nL, with n and L being viscosity and length. Not terribly important for most things. Pressure and radius are the big factors for flow. And look what happens when we have this plaque. The radius of the artery has shrunk a lot. And any little change in radius, because it's to the fourth power, any little change in radius is going to decrease flow. So with this atherosclerosis, they have really low flow to the cardiac muscle. Now, fortunately, in oxygen consumption, you have this ability to compensate, right? So VO2, your heart is highly aerobic. It does aerobic metabolism. That's what it prefers. And so you need a VO2, right? That's aerobic metabolism. In atherosclerosis, you're decreasing the flow. Cardiac output, Q usually means cardiac output, but if you're looking at just a single organ like the heart or a skeletal muscle, instead of it being cardiac output or blood flow to the whole body, we can now look at it as blood flow to the muscle of interest. With the atherosclerosis, because we've had the decrease in the radius, cardiac output drops quite a bit. Or blood flow, not cardiac out, blood flow to the heart, coronary blood flow drops. The AVO2 difference is able to compensate. You're able to extract a little bit more oxygen out of the blood and maintain at least a little bit of a VO2. Because of the ability to compensate by extracting more oxygen out of the blood, you don't have symptoms like chest pain symptoms until the plaque gets huge. Just a rough rule of thumb, if you read, a lot of times people will tell you you can be about 80% occluded, where this size of the artery is decreased by 80% on the inside before you have symptoms of chest pain. That's angina, because you're able to compensate. All right, so now what happens when you get these plaques? One of the things that is often done, the easiest one to explain, is a stent or a bypass. Sorry, let's just focus on a bypass. A bypass, just you hook up a vein. Usually they take a vein, not an artery here, and hook the vein up to go around the clot. They literally bypass the clot so that they can keep the radius high and the flow high so that you can have an appropriate VO2. A stent, all it does is, an angioplasty, you just kind of push that plaque down so that you can have a high radius. Now, angina is where you're not getting enough blood flow to the myocardium, the heart muscle, and the heart lets you know it. I've never had angina, but it's in concept, it's similar to, let's say that you've been working really hard. You've been trying to do as many push-ups as you can, right? When you get to those last push-ups, you feel a lot of burning, a lot of discomfort. Part of that is because you can't get enough blood flow to the active muscles during a push-up to maintain metabolism aerobically, right? So this aerobic metabolism here is out of the question, and you're first forced to go to glycolysis and phosphocreatine. Those fatigue fast, right? And they produce a lot of acid and other byproducts that your body monitors to tell you if you're fatigued. Now, the same thing is going to happen with angina. If you can't make, because of this occlusion, atheroma or plaque, if you can't get enough blood flow down to the artery and your VO2 drops, you're going to have to make your ATP in other ways. And now you're going to be more reliant on glycolysis or maybe a little bit on phosphocreatine. And those produce these metabolites that lead to discomfort and pain and fatigue. Your heart's been beating forever, since before you were born, and it's burning primarily carbohydrates and fats. And if you look at the sustainability of this, aerobic metabolism can go on forever. Glycolysis and phosphocreatine cannot. If you cannot get the VO2 up, you're going to be in trouble. You have two choices. In the case of an atheroma or a plaque here, that's reduced blood flow in your VO2, you either have to decrease how hard you're working, right? You now have to work at below whatever limit ATP consumption rate. You have to work at an ATP consumption rate that can be sustained aerobically at your blunted aerobic capacity, or you have to go into debt using these glycolytic pathways, and your heart's going to let you know it by giving you this discomfort and pain. In the case of a heart attack, you get a thrombus or a big plaque that dislodges, or a blood clot or whatever, that clogs the whole artery. And now no blood can get down. It's all stopped. And anything downstream is not going to have Q. And so you're not going to have flow. And so VO2 is going to go away. You don't have aerobic metabolism. And now you're forced just to use this glycolysis and phosphocreatine, which have only a finite store. So in a heart attack, you can survive a couple of minutes without the aerobic metabolism, but you eventually need to get it restored, or that part of the heart that is clogged is going to die. Okay. Now, similar things happen with peripheral arterial disease. We have plaques again, but these plaques not in the heart. They often happen in the lower limbs, usually around the popliteal artery is one of the major spots for these. You start to get these plaques developed. You can measure the severity of peripheral arterial disease by the difference in blood flow or blood pressure in the arm versus the leg. Most of the plaque in these arterial disease usually happens right around here, where you get plaques reducing blood flow. And because of that low flow, you have low pressure down here. Very rarely do you ever see arterial disease in the arm. So arm, when you're laying down, you should have, let's say, a mean arterial pressure of 93 millimeters of mercury. If you have a bad plaque down here in the leg, that might be 70 millimeters of mercury. In a healthy person laying down, they should be about the same. So you can diagnose the severity of PAD with this ankle brachial index, the difference in blood pressure between the ankle and the arm. I don't care that you understand that so much. When anyone go into any kind of clinical profession, you'll need to know that. But I show you this again so that you understand that having poor blood flow is going to make you not be able to do aerobic metabolism. Here's a study we did a couple of years ago where we measured the oxygen levels in the muscle, in the calf. We had healthy people do a plantar flexion exercise, and when they exercise, they start to consume a little bit of oxygen, and it kind of plateaus, and they're able to deliver the same amount of oxygen they're consuming, and so the oxygen levels don't go that low. Peripheral arterial disease, when they did an even lighter exercise, actually, the oxygen levels in the muscle drops way low. They're not delivering enough oxygen to meet what's being consumed, and so they run out of oxygen down there, and they're forced to use anaerobic metabolism, and they get the equivalent of angina in the leg. The angina is that chest pain with heart disease. If you have the pain in your legs or in your muscles, it's called claudication. And what that is that you don't have enough blood flow to maintain the right VO2, and you're forced to go to anaerobic metabolism, which produces a lot of acid and other things that are uncomfortable, and they feel it. So at light intensity exercise, these patients with peripheral arterial disease, these plaques in lower extremity arteries especially, as they're walking, they start to be more reliant on anaerobic metabolism, and they form a lot of acid, and it gets very uncomfortable, and they stop exercising because of that. So there are a lot of studies going on right now to try and figure out how to minimize that impact. Of course, in PAD, just like in the heart, they can do bypasses where they just have something go around the clot so that you can have blood flow going. But at any rate, hopefully this illustrates why blood flow is important for exercise capacity and artery health. That's it for now, and that wraps up the cardiovascular system. Good luck studying. We'll move on to temperature regulation next.